Welcome to the 11th module in this educational series, where we will explore issues related to the monitoring and evaluation of blood donor programs. We will use the term donor recruitment throughout, but intend this to also embrace all donor retention and donor management activities. Monitoring and evaluation, or M&E, is a broad topic area with relevance throughout your organization. Although naturally, we will focus on the blood donor recruitment function, we will enable understanding of the monitoring and evaluation language used, in particular, the issues of inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, indicators, and impacts. The use of logic models for monitoring and evaluation will be explained in detail, along with the key components of an effective monitoring and evaluation plan. By the end of the module, you should have knowledge and skills necessary to develop an M&E plan for your own organization's donor recruitment program. For any substantial program, M&E is a key requirement and will generally be mandated by senior management. It follows that there is need for an effective monitoring and evaluation program for the donor recruitment function and its key activities. An M&E system allows blood services to assess their progress in meeting defined objectives. This information is shared with stakeholders so that it informs evidence-based program development and resource allocation. Looked at holistically, M&E can be considered an integral part of achieving universal access to safe blood. Donor recruitment staff need to appreciate their responsibilities in this regard. In Module 8, we shared the 6-stage generic planning cycle for blood donor recruitment. We previously covered in detail the first 3 stages of assessment, strategic planning, and design. These are essential in establishing the groundwork for constructing an effective M&E system. Once a work plan has been developed, the next stages of implementation and monitoring, evaluation, and reporting and sharing findings become critical. Together, these constitute the key elements of monitoring and evaluation, which we will be concentrating on in this module. Also in Module 8, we highlighted that in order to develop an effective M&E system, the entire blood transfusion chain should be properly monitored and evaluated. You will notice that blood donor recruitment activity is at the beginning of this chain, but ripples of its performance effects will be felt at the end of the chain and be seen in whether blood is available or not for patients in need. It is for this reason that any M&E relating to donor recruitment will not be complete without focusing on the ultimate availability of blood and blood products. That is to say, the donor recruitment function needs to be able to monitor and evaluate the entire blood supply chain on a daily basis, and then ensure that it responds accordingly to shortages of stock or periods of overcollection. This final recap is simply to emphasize that M&E needs to be embedded in the planning process. Without M&E, it will not be apparent when a program is failing to deliver its anticipated potential. This may be because the plan is flawed or the implementation is suboptimal, but in either case, M&E will provide early-stage evidence of failure and enable a change of approach. Let us now get into the detail of M&E, starting with a working definition of what we mean by the term monitoring. Monitoring can be defined as the collection of information about the activities and the operation of the blood donor recruitment program. Crucially, this is ongoing rather than sporadic or ad hoc. We will unpack and examine the different aspects of this definition in the following slides. Although ongoing implies continuous, in practice, some defined period will be required. This will be determined in part by the nature of the information to be collected and in part by the requirements of any stakeholders. Time periods can variously be daily, weekly, monthly, or annually. For example, monitoring the number of blood donors recruited can be done on a daily basis and retrospectively aggregated into summary results over a longer time period, but year-on-year blood donor retention can only be done annually. Whether using forms or computers, the process of collecting information requires a standardized and consistent approach. Even subtle changes to methodology may make it difficult to compare data over time. In the blood donor recruitment program, each planned activity implies the data that needs to be collected. It is important to stress that monitoring works most effectively where there is a planned program of work. Hence, planning, as discussed in Module 8, is an essential ingredient for effective M&E. The context of the program needs to be adequately defined. In our case, we are focusing on the blood donor recruitment program, the effects of which, as we have seen, can be felt at the end of the chain. Although the blood donor recruitment staff will not handle the blood products directly, they still very much need to be in touch with the dynamics of blood stock management, since their activity is critical to meeting hospital demand. Consequently, monitoring is required at all stages along this blood supply chain. Careful selection of key data to be collected and monitored is critical, since the potential information that can be collected is substantial. If there is poor data selection, this will result in inadequate insight into how the program is operating, either because the data is not sufficiently rich or relevant, or because the analyst becomes overwhelmed. When thinking of donor recruitment practitioners, the doing component is obviously key, but equally important is reflecting occasionally on whether the desired results are being achieved. Evaluation signposts lessons to be learned and opportunities to improve effectiveness. So, following on from our definition of monitoring, evaluation can be defined as the appraisal, in our case, of information about donor recruitment activities. Conversely, whilst ongoing was critical for our consideration of monitoring, periodic is crucial when considering evaluation. The periodic requirement implies some defined time frame for routine activity. This can be quarterly or annually. For specific projects, you will generally need a baseline assessment against which you will determine progress, then further evaluation at the mid and end points. The characteristics component relates to how the blood donor recruitment program is being implemented. Long before outcomes are identifiable, it is generally possible to determine if the operational rollout of activity is as anticipated. Finally, outcomes are changes that occur as a result of implementing the program activity. Examples may be increased blood collections after recruitment campaigns and increased emphasis on M&E after appropriate training. These issues will be discussed further in later slides. It is important to note that there are 3 key reasons for conducting an evaluation, and at least one of these must be apparent in the evaluation exercise for it to be a valid activity. Evaluation is conducted to inform judgments on whether the donor management program is delivering as expected. It will help assess whether the strategy being employed should continue, be adapted, or stopped altogether. When adaptation is needed, evaluation can identify which areas need to be adjusted so that the overall program is enhanced. Lastly, evaluation can identify lessons learned, as this will assist in future program development and establish evidence-based policies and procedures. It is helpful to note that M&E informs the 4 key management functions. One of the core management functions is to plan and implement the blood donor recruitment program. For this function, M&E can guide on the implementation of needed changes. For example, are more older donors needed to smooth out periodic supply problems? The ultimate responsibility for resources rests with the blood services management, but M&E can inform whether resources are sufficient and being used well. Are appropriate numbers of collection staff being sent to collection events, for example? Nothing is more frustrating for a recruiter than donors being turned away because sessions are too busy for staff to cope. But neither should staff be standing idle. There is need for effective communication. M&E is an established vehicle for sharing results with the community on the status of the blood supply, and usually the need for more blood donors. Political stakeholders want to be assured of progress towards achieving planned objectives, and funders must be content that there is effective implementation of the program and appropriate utilization of funds. Advocacy is necessary not just to galvanize local community support. With any healthcare budget, there is competition for funds, and through advocacy, the M&E results can potentially increase political support and leverage additional resources from funders. There are 6 M&E steps required. The first step is the need to understand and describe a blood donor recruitment program. This is a critical stage and needs to be done in a standard and robust manner. Shortly, You will be taken through a logic model development process for the recruitment program, as this helps in understanding and describing this program in line with the minimal expectations from the M&E requirements. Once the activity has been defined, you will need to decide on the required data and how it will be used. It is important to decide how the data will be collected. This will involve the development and validation of all data collection tools, such as forms and questionnaires, as needed. If all is set, the data needs to be collected in a process that ensures data quality issues are observed. Poorly collected data will not be useful for decision-making. Data management and analysis is a critical stage relating to all the processes for data collection, storage, retrieval, and analysis. It is very frustrating to collect but then lose the data simply because basic data management principles have not been observed. There is need to ensure that there is a mechanism to report and use the data in the blood donor recruitment program. All external and internal stakeholders need to be identified and appropriately engaged in sharing the findings. Based on interactions and experiences in blood service operations, there are historical challenges that the donor recruitment program will face in the absence of rigorous M&E. One of the key challenges is failure to attract sufficient blood donors, without which the entire system collapses, resulting in insufficient blood collections to meet the national need. In the absence of key M&E data to inform planning and budgeting, a lack of adequate resources may result. In cases where the resources are available, in the absence of M&E, there may be a lack of accountability on their use in blood donor recruitment. This is a situation where you might find that the telephone, mileage, and fuel usage is on the high side and not being matched with returns on blood donor recruitment outputs or outcomes. M&E allows us to learn from past mistakes and have the opportunity to gravitate towards best practice. As a recruiter, you might be asking yourself why you need to invest time and energy on M&E. There are many benefits to having a formal M&E system in your work, foremost of which is that it is impossible to improve without one. However, the good news is that M&E can be conducted at different levels of sophistication. So, it is possible to take a gradual approach, moving from basic M&E to something more complex. But ultimately, the need to make evidence-based decisions cannot be overemphasized, and M&E can robustly provide this. M&E should not be seen as intimidating, rather as something to be embraced. With M&E, as with any area specialist discipline, there are norms and standards generally observed and a common language shared by practitioners. We will be discussing terminology in the coming slides, alongside the various M&E activities that can be undertaken. A logic model for blood donor recruitment will also be highlighted. There are different types of M&E activities that can be undertaken for a blood donor recruitment program, and we highlight these here. The formative evaluation is the assessment and planning. The objective here is to collect the information and data needed to plan the blood donor program and initiatives. The data at this stage may describe the needs of the stakeholders, such as blood donors, staff, patients, funders, and regulators. It is imperative that these formative evaluations are undertaken as they inform an evidence-based planning process. This involves answering the key question: what is the problem? The aim of input-output monitoring is to collect data. This might include the number of blood donors reached, blood collections achieved, blood and blood products processed and distributed, services provided, or resources used. Process evaluation focuses on collecting detailed data about how the recruitment intervention was delivered, to which individuals or groups, and the response. We may need to assess whether blood donors respond positively by coming to donate to different communication channels such as telephone calls, SMS, and email. Outcome monitoring tracks measures related to the desired outcomes of the recruitment program, such as changes in knowledge, attitudes, or behaviors regarding blood donation. Outcome evaluation considers data about outcomes before and after the intervention. For example, comparisons can be made on the rates of blood donation before and after the introduction of a youth blood donor program, such as the Pledge 25 Club. Ideally, There will be a control group that did not participate in the intervention being evaluated so that the impact of environmental factors can be discounted. Impact monitoring generally involves tracking blood and blood product supplies over time at a district, provincial, regional, or national level. Impact evaluation is used to establish a causal link between the recruitment program and outcomes, reaching beyond those specifically targeted by activity. Examples might include impacts on maternal deaths, disease prevalence, or quality of life. It has been shown in studies that almost all organizations conduct input-output monitoring. Most perform process evaluation, some conduct output monitoring and evaluation, and few undertake impact monitoring and evaluation. There are various ways in which a program such as blood donor recruitment can be described. In this module, the logic model has been selected as the reference model to illustrate the fundamentals that are needed in designing and implementing a comprehensive M&E system for any blood service. A logic model can be defined as a graphic that shows program activities, outcomes you anticipate, and resources you will require to carry out the activities. It can also be described as a roadmap, conceptual map, blueprint, theoretical underpinning, rationale, causal chain, logic framework, or program theory. There are two types of logic models, namely the planned and actual logic model. The planned implementation and outcomes logic model is developed at the formative stage of recruitment program planning. This logic model can be used to describe the intended implementation. It will also show expected outcomes. In developing this, there is application and use of theory, experience, and scientific evidence so that the blood donor recruitment program is well designed. The actual implementation and outcomes logic model is developed once the blood donor program is implemented. This logic model will be used to describe how the recruitment program is actually operated and demonstrate achieved outcomes. All these can effectively contribute to theory, experience, and scientific evidence in a virtuous cycle. The entire blood donor recruitment program can be broken down into 5 interrelated key components. These are inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. The inputs are the resources needed and used in a blood donor recruitment program, such as money, staff, and vehicles. The activities are undertakings in the blood donor recruitment program which allow it to accomplish its objectives, such as blood donor education, mobilization, and recruitment. The outputs are the direct products or deliverables of the blood donor recruitment program or project, such as the number of blood donors recruited, number of blood units collected, or number of blood products distributed. The outcomes are program results that occur both immediately and sometime after the activities are completed, such as an increase in the overall number of blood donors and blood collected, or positive changes in blood donor knowledge, attitudes, practices, and behaviors. The impacts are the long-term results generated by the blood donor recruitment program over time. This might be positive changes in the supply of blood and blood products, and fewer units testing positive for transfusion-transmitted infections. Developing a logic model is a stepwise approach that involves specific activities. The first task is to develop a problem statement for the blood donor recruitment program. The formative evaluation can help at this stage. Thereafter, there is need to define the expected impacts and desired outcomes of the program implementation. It will be important to identify the key activities to be implemented and determine the corresponding outputs. Lastly, there is need to specify the inputs that will be required. It is important to emphasize that developing a logic model is an interactive and participatory process that demands various stakeholders' contribution. There are various benefits derived by developing a donor recruitment program logic model. It will provide a framework for organizing the program data and help communicate its purpose. The donor recruitment program planning will be informed by a logic model. It will illustrate the blood program internal logic and reveal assumptions about the activities and the intended results. For a blood donor recruitment program to work, there is need to confirm the program theory test hidden assumptions, and highlight critical activities, all tasks with which the logic model can assist. It may be helpful to highlight the key characteristics of a good logic model. A starting point is to have a logic model that contains a problem statement that identifies underlying causes. The logic model should include inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts, and it should also reflect agreement among major stakeholders about intended implementation and outcomes. The logic model should illustrate clear, sequential, and logical linkages between each of its parts. It is expected that the logic model needs to include outcomes responsive to the issues identified in the problem statement. Also, realistic outcomes which are within the scope of the blood donor recruitment program to influence. Just to illustrate the key concepts, an overall blood safety logic model for Zimbabwe is provided. It reflects all the 5 components already discussed, with the blood donor recruitment program integrated within the overarching organizational logic model framework. This helps to ensure that there is interaction between the various subcomponents of blood service operations. It is important to start with this overall logic model at the highest level of management before moving to a specific blood donor recruitment model. It is also important to appreciate that a whole organization view is required for M&E because the benefits you will be attempting to measure are unlikely to manifest themselves solely within the recruitment department or even necessarily within the blood service. You therefore require a model that has a similar broad view. To provide an easy startup for logic model development, a generic blood donor recruitment program is provided. This can be adapted and linkages provided for a specific setting as required. It is important to validate a developed logic model by assessing whether it is meaningful, plausible, doable, and testable. Whilst we have opted to concentrate on the logic model, it is not the only available tool that can be used. An alternative is the theory of change, also a useful approach for M&E development. This example shows how the theory of change was applied in Zimbabwe to tackle teamwork inefficiencies. You are encouraged to read more on the logic, theory of change, and any other model that may be in use in your blood service. The logic model is widely used because its components are common currency as business terminology around the world. However, you may find the theory of change helpful when introducing and evaluating new work programs. The recruitment program M&E will be able to be effectively developed in a setting where the goals and objectives are properly defined. The goal is a broad and general statement about desired long-term aspirations that generally reflects wider stakeholder concerns and interests. Examples include having a constant supply of blood and blood products. Objectives are statements of desired recruitment program aims. A set of objectives contributes to achieving the larger goal. We can define process and outcome objectives. It is important to ensure that the blood donor recruitment program objectives are SMART, that is, specific, measurable, appropriate, realistic, and time-based. In designing an M&E system, there is need to identify key monitoring and evaluation questions that need to be answered from the recruitment program data. These M&E questions are derived from the components of the logic model. The key factors to consider when developing M&E questions include: how useful is the information for improving a program? Nice to know or need to know? Are there any sources where the same information is already available? How easy or difficult is it to answer the question? Finally, are human and financial resources available to collect and analyze the data necessary to answer the question? There are both internal and external uses of M&E data. In both cases, it is important to note that the use of findings implies being held accountable, making decisions about program improvement, and using data to develop knowledge to help identify best practices. There are 5 steps to be undertaken for effectively using the recruitment program data for decision making. The first step is to identify stakeholders' needs and their interest in the program. The second step is to determine what stakeholders want to know and what M&E questions need to be asked. In step 3, there is a determination of what data will answer the questions. The fourth step allows for the development of a data use plan. The last step, 5, anticipates that feedback will be solicited from stakeholders on the usefulness of the data generated. There is need to highlight the issues of measures and indicators in monitoring and evaluation. Measures are data used to describe a blood donor recruitment program. These can either be quantitative measures, such as the number of blood donors or blood collections, or qualitative measures, such as a blood donor donation satisfaction index. However, it should be noted that, since anything can be measured, measures alone do not necessarily provide information on effectiveness. Therefore, indicators are required for M&E purposes. An indicator is a data set measured over time that documents changes in processes, outcomes, or capacity. These are essentially the signposts of change, indicating whether objectives are being achieved. It should be noted that an indicator does not provide proof or explanation about specific changes resulting from programs. This should be done in a complementary manner. A key example of indicators are the data periodically collected by WHO through the Global Database for Blood Safety and PEPFAR blood safety indicators, as shown on the screenshots on this slide. Just like the objectives, the indicators must be SMART, as discussed earlier. An example of an indicator is the number of new blood donors recruited nationally in year X. According to UNAIDS, a good indicator should meet the 6 standards shown on the slide. These are that the indicator is needed and useful, has technical merit, is fully defined, is feasible to measure, has been field tested or used operationally. And finally, where indicators are developed or presented as a set, this set should be coherent and balanced. The overall aim is to link the baseline information from formative assessment, goals, targets, and the indicators to have a well-informed M&E system. All the key requirements we have discussed so far will need to be consolidated into a single document known as the Monitoring and Evaluation Action Plan for the Blood Donor Recruitment Program. This action plan is a written document that explains how the blood service will implement different monitoring and evaluation activities, what data are needed, how data will be used, and the resources required to undertake each activity. There are various components that need to be reflected in an M&E action plan, many of which we have already examined. There is a need to properly describe the program using your preferred tools and reflect on the purpose of M&E activity and the questions to be used. The other aspects to include are a description of what data will be collected, methods for collecting, analyzing, managing, and disseminating this data, instruments for gathering data, and description of data flows. There is need to also have descriptions of who will implement various aspects of the plan, resources needed to implement the plan, timeline for completing M&E activities, and an indication of how the data will be used. Note that M&E activities may be carried out by blood donor recruitment program staff, other stakeholders, external experts, or consultants. As we conclude this module, a few examples of applications of M&E in a blood service setting may be helpful. The trends in blood collections seen here show a distinct pattern of seasonal shortage, while the bar chart reveals the over-reliance on school-based blood donors. This has helped in strategic planning as the country is now working on increasing adult blood donors. To be able to do this, a number of innovative strategies have been developed, such as establishing a contact center to target adult blood donors for recruitment. This slide shows a snapshot of blood supply management issues that are addressed through effective monitoring and evaluation. The aim is to maintain a 5-day stock level for all blood groups with a flagging system in place. Shown also is the M&E of strategic plans, which is crucial at the institutional level and can be cascaded down to functional departments. Annually, it becomes possible to assess the blood supply performance as shown on the graphs. As previously seen, it is now a common practice among blood services to monitor and publish their daily blood stock levels on their website. This is something a blood donor recruiter should encourage their blood establishments to implement. It is highly desirable to use M&E results in a performance management system as shown on this abstract screenshot. This gives an objective rather than subjective basis for performance assessment. In conclusion, it is hoped that this M&E module has provided helpful background for those looking to instill a more disciplined approach to donor recruitment management. Please consider these reflective practice questions as you consolidate your monitoring and evaluation appreciation, understanding, and implementation. In Module 12, we will look at research for evidence-based practice.